welcome y'all to this week of continuing in the church involvement continuum. I'm pretty pumped about this because obviously I'm very passionate about what I'm going to talk about today. And I am one of those guys that God called to relaunch, and we did it out of obedience to Jesus. And I think just like last week, when we were hearing from Roy about hybrid, and he was really defending hybrid out of the call that God had in his life, I would do the same thing in defending relaunch because I'm doing it out of obedience to Jesus. So none of us are here to say this is what you need to do because you need to do what the Spirit tells you to do in prayer. But I'm going to be very passionate about why I think relaunching is an amazing way to go if this is what the Lord leads you to do, and share it unapologetically. So I do want to take a moment to kind of go through the church continuum. We want to make sure that there's clarity in what in the world are we talking about? Why are we talking about this involvement continuum, and what does it really mean? And I just put together a super simple slide that maybe will help bring a deeper level of clarity to this. So give me thumbs up if you guys can see this okay. Awesome. So when you think about where are you going to be involved in this, the first step for anybody, in my opinion, is get training. Because it's not until after the training or through the training that you need to start deciding what is God leading you to do. And this hopefully will help bring clarity to the whole process. This is what this whole series is about. Where am I going to be involved with my church on this continuum? We've already talked about blessing, which is catching the vision. Don't resist it, but bless the movement work in your area and pray. What's the pastor role or a key leader role? Any pastor can do this without any pushback. You're just blessing people. We're going to speak life over it. We're going to bless it. That's our role. The second part of the involvement continuum is we're going to release. We're going to catch the vision. We're not going to resist it. Same thing. But now we're going to release some of your radicals to be trained by a DMM trainer because you've been trained and sent out as missionaries from your city. The pastor's role now shifts to needing leadership approval because this now is something that's going to have an impact on the church. And you're going to send out some of your radicals, some of your best. They could be givers or volunteers. And so the involvement has now changed in position to release. And you can see each one of these gets a little bit longer and a little bit deeper in the process. Hybrid is what Roy shared with us last week. Some of the same elements, I'm not going to read them over, but now what we're adding is not only are we sending out the radicals and as missionaries and they're trained, but now there's an entire DMM track in your church that you're publicly promoting and inviting people to join, which is where the deeper level of hybrid gets involved. And the pastor role now is you need to get leadership approval for this because it's even more difficult. And I don't really think these are levels, but I think for sake of clarity, just thinking of it than level 2, because now it's a public focus of your entire church. Next week, Jim is going to talk about transition, which is all the things from bless, release, and hybrid. But now we're going to leverage everything in your church to support the DMM vision. And we're moving towards transitioning into this wholeheartedly. This is the primary focus of the church. And a pastor role, few pastors will be able to do this unless they are the founding pastor or have been there long-term and can get leadership or congregational buy-in. Now, the one thing that I'm going to say about that statement is I think that's true unless this is what the Spirit tells your church to do. The Holy Spirit cancels out that entire comment because you can never go wrong with being obedient to what the Lord is leading you to do. And then the last one, which is what I'm talking about today, and it's what God called us to do, is relaunch. And it's everything in bless, release, hybrid, and transition. But now you're not just leveraging everything and transitioning to it, but you're sending out everyone to plant DMM churches, or if God, as you release people, some people will go to other churches and keep doing what they were doing before. But what the primary point and focal point of everything that you do is planting DMM churches. And again, I think the Holy Spirit trumps everything I'm about to say, but even fewer pastors will be able to do this unless they're the founding pastors or they have a long-term relationship and can get leadership and congregational buy-in. So if you see up here in the top right corner, the absolute most important thing for you to do is listen to the Spirit and do whatever the Spirit tells you to do. And I've got one more slide that I put together here. This is really the bottom line of everything I'm going to say today. We should do exactly what the Spirit tells us to do, period. And Chris shares this in his blog. And if you've never read the blog posts on the continuum, I highly encourage you to read every one of them in depth so that you have a better understanding of what this continuum is all about, and that you don't linger a long time on pressing into saying, God, what are you asking me to do? And recognize that when God asks you to do it, it's probably going to push you out of your comfort zone one way or the other. And you need to take steps towards obedience and doing what he tells you to do. I took this straight from Chris's blog, but he says in Revelation 2 and 3, Jesus speaks directly to the 7 churches. And the one thing Jesus says to each church that we also need to hear and obey today, right now in our context, in our settings, in our churches, is anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he's saying to the churches. And that would be my biggest encouragement. This journey has been incredibly blessed for us, not always easy, but incredibly blessed for us because we're being obedient to what the Spirit said to our church, and we're doing it. And all the pictures you see on the right are from our journey into the DMM world and what that looks like. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about our journey and what that's like. And then I'd also want to give you a chance to ask some questions. And the first person I'm going to invite to ask questions after I share some of our journey is Chris, because he's also done this and he might have some specific questions that would help you right out of the gate that would save us some time that I haven't thought of. So where did all this start for me to say, hey, we're going to even press into asking questions about what does it mean to multiply and to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples? Well, if you don't know our story, I was a traditional church planter, legacy model. We planted a church and then planted another church out of that church that was an autonomous church that ultimately became a campus. And then we planted another campus, and all those campuses were within about an hour of each other. So they were in different Central Oregon cities. We had buildings that we'd taken over. We were doing storefront style church. So we'd take over, it'd be like, just for simplicity, Best Buy, a grocery store, mission church. And, our spaces were expensive, but we also live in a culture that's very expensive to do legacy church compared to maybe what some of you are in. I don't know any churches in Oregon that are using a public space that spend much less than $5,000 a month. And many churches spend $12,000, $16,000 a month to have a space if they're leasing it or renting it. And our cost per real estate is very high. So this all factors into some of our decisions as well. And I'd been wrestling with multiplication for years, y'all. I didn't know anything about DMM. I didn't know anything about CPM. I just knew that I wanted to see lost people come to know Jesus. And I wanted to do that in a way that was the most effective, which is why we originally got into the attractional model of ministry, because I got into church planting and I saw more people come to know Jesus in 1 year than I had my whole life combined. And I was like, this must be it. But the further we got into it, the more I recognized this is not duplicatable. And again, this is my story. I'm not speaking about other churches or situations. I'm talking about the call that God has in my life to multiply, right? And I started looking at our costs, right? So after we had 3 campuses, we were $37,000, $38,000 a month in expenses coming in and going out to do what we were doing. And it revolved around a handful of key leaders. You take those key leaders out of it, what do you have left? In my opinion, not much. I started dabbling in how do you multiply something and what does duplication look like? So I did things like take sabbaticals, and we'd come back after the entire summer of being gone and see what it would look like and what worked and what didn't work. Then we did this crazy thing before I got into disciple making, where we moved 3 hours away over the mountains in Oregon, away from Central Oregon, to a completely different city to launch Mission Church Portland. And out of that journey, learned a ton that when you remove a key leader from the founding campus and move 3 hours away and start a fourth campus of the church plant and empower younger leaders to take over, that's a whole nother thing that you learn about multiplication, what works, what doesn't work. And through this, I just began wrestling, y'all, with the fact that most of what we do in the Western American church is not duplicatable and reproducible. The cost of it was extreme. And I started going on after we launched our fourth campus, and we led over 1,600 people into a conversion relation to Jesus. I just went on our prayer retreat and said, God, too much of this rests on my shoulders and a very small multi-site staff. And you start taking people out of the equation, and we'd lost a couple of campus pastors. So I knew what that journey was like, trying to replace a campus pastor. And on the entire prayer retreat, God asked me one question: what did I tell you to do? And the whole prayer retreat, I didn't have the answer to the question. It took me 3.5 months to figure out what the answer to the question was. And I was reading in Matthew 9 and 10 and got in one of those modes where I was just ended up reading the entire from 9 and 10 all the way to the end of the book of Matthew. And I finished and I started just kind of spending time talking to the Lord. And I was like, that question you asked me on the prayer retreat 3.5 months ago, I think I know the answer to the question. And for the first time, I mean, God is always faithful to speak through the word, but I was used to him speaking with some pretty deep clarity in my life. For the first time, I hadn't heard that for 3.5 months. And I said, God, I know the answer to the question. You told me to make disciples. And God said to me, and this was my part of why we did what we did. For the first time in 3 months, he spoke with that clarity that I was used to. And he said, then why are you building a church? You make disciples, I'll build the church. And he said it to me 3 times. You make disciples, I'll build the church. So that's why I started pressing in. That's why I went through the training with eLife. That's why I started for the first time in my life reading books about church planting movements and disciple making movements. And as I pressed into that and what God had called us to do, I started recognizing from my experience of what we'd learned of what works, what doesn't work, the cost of what we're doing. You know, I learned in reading Chris's book about the cost per baptism. And, you know, if you take your payroll and your building costs and liability insurances and programming costs, everything that you do, and divide it annually by the number of baptisms, which it might not be the most important metric, but I think it's a very valuable metric. I started realizing like our cost per baptism was somewhere between $6,700 per baptism, at some campuses all the way up to $24,000 per baptism. So it wasn't $1.5 million per baptism, which is the American average per baptism. But I started saying, man, I live in Portland, Oregon, a city metro area of 2.4 million people, a place where there are lots of people disconnected from a relationship with Jesus. And I have yet in this journey of disciple making movements, catch this, to meet one pastor that has a cost of baptism in any context less than $5,000 per baptism. I've yet to meet one pastor. And I know a lot of pastors, you guys. And I started thinking to myself, man, if I partnered with a group of churches in Portland and we said, we want to reach 10,000 people for Jesus, and somehow miraculously, we whittled our cost of baptism down to $5,000 per baptism, doing the model we were doing, we would need $50 million to reach 10,000 people. And I just wasn't okay with that. And God had my heart in this, and he was pressing deep into me. I hadn't really even heard about the involvement continuum. And I was already to the place early on in the eLife training where I was like, I think God's calling me to go all in. I think the Spirit's speaking to me and saying, don't turn back. And before COVID was a thing in November of 2019, I brought our leaders together, multi-site staff, board, advisory teams at each campus, and a bunch of key leaders. And I think there was about 90 plus people in one of our campuses auditoriums. And I just began to share some of the things that God was doing, what he had said to me on the prayer retreat, how I'd looked across our campuses. And though I was super grateful for all that God had done, lives that had changed, marriages restored, addictions broken, I was concerned that I didn't see a disciple who had made a disciple, and that person had made a disciple, and that person had made a disciple. We did not have generational discipleship growth. And I just began to share that stuff. I started sharing the cost of baptism, the wrestling that I'd been doing for years about multiplication and how, this is a struggle. And when it was all said and done, y'all, we went into a time of prayer. And I remember the first 11 minutes of that prayer time, nobody prayed. There's just silence in the room. And I said to God during that time of silence, God, if I'm the only one, it's okay. I'm going to stand before the throne of God someday, and I'm going to be accountable for what you tell me to do. And I know what you're telling me to do. The Spirit has spoken to my heart. So if I'm the only one, if it means I need to resign, if it means I need to find my own replacement, if it needs our whole church relaunches, I'm doing this no matter what. But as the church planter, the founder of this church, the leader, I'm going to press into what the Spirit's telling our corporate church to do. And after I said that, it was several minutes later that we entered into about an hour and a half of people just repenting, specifically for where we were as a church. And when we ended that time of prayer, we kind of looked at one another. We never took a vote. We locked eyes with one another, and we knew we were relaunching our church. So you saw that on the continuum into disciple making movement. And we were going to leverage everything that we had to do this, which sounds exciting and risky and fun and all this kind of stuff. But it's multifaceted. It's exciting. I've caught glimpses of multiplication since we made that decision. Times where I've walked down to the bank of a river and seen people baptize people through Discovery Bible studies, and seen entire groups get baptized simultaneously, and discover it through Discovery Bible studies by themselves. I've a couple times walked down with my wife to the river, and I've said, as a family with my 3 teenagers, I can never go back. I can never go back. But at the same time, we had to offload 4 campuses, replace leases, find people to take over long-term leases. We had $37,000 a month in lease payments. And there were times, I'll be honest with you, where you got to answer the call of God. And if it's a call of God, know that when you hit the hard times, you lean on the call and you say, God, you called me to do this. So yes, this is a problem, but it's not really my problem. I need you to help me solve this financial problem. And I'm not saying God's going to drop tens of thousands of dollars into everybody's lap if you decide to relaunch your church. But here's what I'm telling you. God is faithful. And there were multiple times, you guys, I'm not talking about once or twice. I'm talking about 3 or 4 times where God provided $10,000, $20,000 ways out of lease expenses, a bill coming up that we needed $40,000 to solve the problem in order to keep moving into DMM because we had to offload this building, solve these payroll things, do this over here. And God made a way every stinking time. In December of this last year, I went off of payroll for the first time in 26 years as a full-time pastor. And I'm now tent making and providing for my family and trying to be strategic about that. So do it in 12 to 15 hours a week so that I have all the rest of my time to put towards disciple making and leadership. And our last building, there was only one building that we owned, and it was after we moved to Portland. We were gifted a building, and it's debt-free. And that building closes on April the 29th. So on April the 29th, we are a church without buildings. We haven't been using that building for a while anyway, but there's a lot of things. This is kind of one of my funny things that I share people through this journey. We have offloaded 41 projectors. Now, if you wonder why we needed to repent, maybe it's because we had 41 projectors that over years we purchased. Now, they weren't all being used, but I'd go to my tech team and I'd open up a closet and I'd be like, what are these 6 projectors on the shelf in here? And I'd say, do they work? Well, sort of, but not really. Like 1 pixel, and that one's super bright and it's super annoying. So we had to buy a new projector and replace it. And so many times through this journey, you guys, I'm like, oh, Jesus, I repent. I totally repent of how we're not great stewards of this money. So through the journey, we've gone 100% into DMM. We trained people in phases. We did 95 people at the beginning. Then we did another training that had like 60 some people. And then we did a third training. We were willing to train and keep training, and we're still training people today. So training has been a huge piece of it. We've blessed some people to go to other churches. They've said, you know what, Brent, we believe that this is the right thing. We know that you're answering God's call. It's the first time in my ministry where people have left our church for lots of reasons, but they didn't leave mad. I've had over 26 years of ministry, lots of people leave mad. They're mad about this or mad about this. This is one time where people left our church, and I can honestly tell you they didn't leave mad. They might have left disappointed. They might have left like wishing that they had what they had before, but they didn't leave mad because they knew that we were doing and obeying what God was telling us to do. And I think that when you do that, God has some kind of a favor that goes with you through obedience that makes a way and moves obstacles and mountains that just wouldn't be able to move if you weren't being obedient. And so I'll just tell you that there's been many times, and Chris and Susie and Jim and Joe Camerlini is somebody that's been on this journey with me, where I'll just be super honest. It has not been easy, but I have 0 regrets, and I have loved every minute of it because I know what God called us to do. And what the Spirit told us to do it, I knew that I was going to be standing before the throne of God someday and be accountable for what he told us to do. So we've seen some groups launched. We've seen some groups multiply to the second and even the third generation. We've seen new Discovery Bible studies start. And we are a church without buildings, making disciples who make disciples who make disciples, and learning how to do it as we go. And that's a glimpse at what a relaunch looks like. So I'm going to check out the chat here. Chris, Brent, you have any questions?
Yeah, Brent, this is great. And I'll kind of compile some of the questions in the chat and throw them to you here in a second. But a couple things I'd love you to touch on. And I think what you shared was very clear and helpful to everybody listening. You know, and you kind of started talking about this, but maybe you could say a few more things about it. I mentioned this in the Bless and Release weeks, and then I asked Roy about it last week. And that is just the costs, common costs of relaunch. I don't mean financial, just things you're giving up, things that are different, things that are hard. And let me maybe pitch one of them to you, and then you can address others as well. One of the costs I hear associated with relaunch that really scares people to death, Brent, and we've talked about this, is Chris, Brent, the Lord may tell me to relaunch, but I don't even know if I could follow him if he told me, because the church provides for my family. I mean, financially, what would I do? Like, I went to seminary, I'm a trained pastor, so I'm leading this church. So I want to be open, but that's one of the costs, Brent, that I think immediately comes to the surface for pastors even thinking about this. And again, like Brent has said, you guys, we didn't choose relaunch. You shouldn't choose relaunch. You should let the Lord lead you. But of course, all of us should be willing to relaunch, of course, if that's what the Lord wants you to do. And if you relaunch, you may be in Brent's shoes or my shoes, and where you make money in a different way. And Brent, as you know, for some reason, pastors especially, it scares them to death the idea of, trying to make money in a different way, and could they even make money in a different way? So that's one of the obvious costs. There may be more. Would you speak to that cost and any others that you would associate with Relaunch?
Well, Chris, I think at the beginning, the fear for me was I came to the conclusion that I'd never been dependent on the Lord to provide for me. I had allowed the church for 26 years to provide. And, if one person's going to get paid in a legacy church, it's going to be the lead pastor. And I think for me, Chris, this is the first time in my life where I've been dependent on the Lord. And I had to learn that the same God who gave me the ability to lead in the church has also given me the ability to provide for my family. And ultimately, God's the provider. But I think pastors are highly skilled and have the ability to provide and to do it in a timely manner in a short amount of time. And God will use the process of you providing for your family to help you. And this is something that I've grabbed onto through the journey. I've learned that if we're going to see an army of disciple makers sweep through our cities and our regions, with that, we also have to have an army of tent makers. And I think that if you're going to have an army of tent makers, you need to know how to be a tent maker. So I think that's the big thing is, Chris, is that we are totally capable of providing and doing that in a way that honors God, makes it a ministry while you're doing it, and also gives you a platform for being around people who are disconnected from a relationship with Jesus. So that'd be my answer to that, Chris, is that don't be a chicken. Recognize that you're gifted and talented, and every gift that God's given you, he's going to bless this. If your heart is to be obedient, then God's going to give you the ability to provide for your family. Don't be a chicken. Other things that I think that you have to process and go through is that because you've done things one way for so long, and they might be personal preferences to you. There were some things that were personal preferences to Heather and I that we just enjoy. Like, I have 2 degrees in music. I'm a production guy. Like, there's some things that I like haze machines. There's things that I personally have personal preferences, and I had to let go of some of my personal preferences to be obedient to God. And for years, I've challenged other people to let go of their personal preferences to do the thing that I was wooing them to do in ministry. Now God's asking me to let go of some personal preferences to be obedient to what he's telling me to do. And so I think that's another one, Chris, is that you have to let go of some personal preferences, and it's okay to go through a season of mourning that you don't personally get to have that right now. But it doesn't mean that you'll never have it or that you can't ever enjoy it again. It just means that it can't be the primary thing that drives you or that you seek after. And so I think that brings you to a third thing. This is a big one. Where do you actually get your identity from? And lots of leaders, pastors, me included, I recognized through this process that my identity was placed in a lot of wrong places. And that my value came from things that were very prideful. And when God began to remove those things from my life, he was able to address some of those things that I honestly didn't even know were there. And that process isn't particularly fun to go through, but it is incredibly rewarding. And I believe God refines you and prepares you for something that he has in store for all of us in the days ahead. So those are 3 things that came to my mind in that question.
Brent, that's so good. Let me ask you one more, kind of put a couple of things together, and then I want to go to some of these in the chat. And I think about this sometimes too. The reason you're expressing that you did Relaunch is because that's what the Lord's told you to do. And so you're being obedient. But Brent, the Lord probably told you to do it for some strategic reasons. What do you think are maybe the strategic reasons the Lord had you relaunch? One might be, that you might say kind of a follow-up question is just, I was going to ask, is like, has Relaunch freed up your time as a leader to focus on multiplying disciples in ways that maybe hybrid or transition wouldn't have freed up your time? And so now with a Relaunch strategy, maybe strategically the Lord saw it would free you up more, but kind of in that vein, if that makes sense. What do you think, since the Lord told you to do it, you're acting in obedience? Why do you think he might have told you to relaunch? And, what are some strategic reasons why, and how has that helped, free up some of your time to focus on multiplying disciples?
It's such a good question. I think the biggest one is a freedom of time. If you relaunch, you will go through transition as well. And during that season of transition, you get to learn what it's like to be hybrid, because there is a season on the way to relaunch where you go through the hybrid and you go through the transition to get to the relaunch. And man, I recognized we had people that were spending 2 to 8 hours a week producing a 1-hour experience on a Sunday morning. And I mean, seriously, like children's workers, worship team people, hospitality people who are spending 8 hours. And I'm not saying any of those things are wrong. I'm just saying that what they were doing was taking 2 to 8 hours a week to produce a 1-hour experience on a Sunday morning that had little to nothing to do with making a disciple. So time is a huge one. And I think that when you recognize, like, okay, I got to keep this producing a worship service, and we've got these programs over here, and we've got all these bills and assets that we still have to protect. And if we ruffle too many feathers, then we can't protect these assets for our church. Like, it is complicated. And I'm just being honest from my own perspective of obedience to the Lord, that I recognize that sometimes the reason I didn't want to keep pressing forward is because I didn't want to let go of assets, or I felt like I had to protect those assets. So I think that that's another piece of the puzzle, is that it'll free up time. It'll free up resources. Here's one that I did not anticipate. Because we were blessing people and saying, hey, if God's leading you to go to another church, go for it. But those of us who begin to obey and press into this, we also begin to meet other people that God was preparing to be a part of this, who we never would have met if we hadn't have said, God, we're going to relaunch, and we're going to let these people go, and we're going to start obeying, and we're going to begin to pray that you'll bring more workers to go into the harvest field, and then find out that God has already prepared a whole new group of people to join you. So that there's this weird thing, because you're letting go, but while you're letting go, you've opened up your hand. So now you can receive, and God will bring people that he's already prepared. And this is something that's happened on this call, you guys. It's kind of crazy. There was several weeks in a row where we had been praying on the Thursday call, God, would you bring more workers to go into the harvest field? And like the next week, somebody would pop on the call who'd already been trained through the eLife training, and they lived 15 minutes from me, 20 minutes from me. Wayne's on here. Chris is on here. There's multiple people on this call who are in the Portland area. And we actually did a training this last week together with some new disciple makers in the Portland area. And we're now collaborating together. And I'll tell you one big thing that's happened to me for the first time in my life. I'm no longer in competition with other churches. And I'm not saying that I did it on purpose, because when I was doing what we were doing, I was never in competition on purpose. But looking backwards, I'll be honest with you, there's no way that you cannot be in some kind of competition, because you're protecting assets, payrolls, programs, and lots of other things in the process. So those are a couple of things that I'm just trying to be honest with you guys.
Right. That's a good word, man. That's awesome. Hey, let me pitch some of these to you from the chat.
Yeah.
Somebody's asking, what if you don't know yet what the Lord wants you to do in your church? Do you just keep praying? Do you wait? Do you take some other kind of next step? How do you advise somebody that would say, I want to implement DMM in my church, but I don't yet know how the Lord wants us to do it?
Hey, if you don't know what God's calling the church to do yet, yes, definitely you need to pray, but you need to do it personally. Because if you went through the training and you followed it, and you know that God's telling you to make disciples, you do not need your church to do this for you to make disciples. And a lot of people are trying to get their whole church to do it, but they haven't even done it themselves. So that's what I'd say first is like, you need to do this personally and create the margin in your life to do this personally, because I don't believe we can expect our churches to do it when we're not doing it. So pray with people who are already doing this, making disciples. That's really important. That Thursday prayer call was a game changer for me, Because when you start praying with people who are praying for multiplication, it changes you. So those would be a couple of pieces of advice I'd give.
That's great, Brent. Somebody else asked, over what time frame did your transition take place to Relaunch? And how long did it take you to start seeing groups begin to multiply?
We started the relaunch process in October of 2019. There's this thing that happened in March of 2020 called COVID. So we had already trained 120 some people across all of our leaders and pressed into it. And we were already having deep conversations, and we were already relaunching because of obedience to God before COVID happened. So when COVID happened, I said to our leadership team, we're not going back. We're going to leverage COVID. We're going to use this to our advantage. And so we sped the process up. Another reason we had to speed the process up is because when people start leaving your church, you can't keep paying a $15,000 a month lease payment on one location when you're blessing people and releasing them. So we had to start trusting in God. Hey, God, what's your plan for this 7-year lease that we're in? Because legally we're liable to pay that 7-year lease. So God, you told us to do this. What's your plan for that 7-year lease? So you guys, there's some moments of truth when you obey where you got to say, okay, God, what does this mean? So our timeline moved up fast when COVID hit. We started having deep conversations, and I would say, Joe, you can give me thumbs up on this, but most of our transition happened within a year and a half from when we started the journey. And again, lots of offloading of buildings, equipment, meeting after meeting, prayer times. But it was a year and a half of pressing into it. And I would say now it's been, just barely the 2-year point. And we are just now offloading our 4th building. It takes time when you are doing all the things that we were doing. God gave us a couple wins early on within weeks of us pressing into saying we're going to turn all of our small groups into DMM churches. And within weeks, we had started a discovery Bible study with a gal, and I'd say it was probably their 3rd Bible sequence, and they were doing like 6-week Bible sequences. So about 12 to 14 weeks in, we saw an entire group get baptized. So I think God gave us a few early wins because he knew that I needed it, because I'm kind of like Thomas, like, let me touch it and let me feel it and let me experience it. And God's like, oh, I know what you need, and I'm not going to criticize you for it because I love you. And he let us see that early on. And then we had a season where we didn't see that for a long time. We just have to obey. And I want to say one thing, because God's laying on my heart. If you truly say, I'm going to be a disciple maker, you need to fall in love with obedience and talk about just the fact that you've found joy in it more than the fruit. The fruit's up to God. And I'm telling you, when you really say, like, I'm going to chase obedience to Jesus, I'm going to be obedient, I'm going to do this with other people, and you fall in love with that more than the fruit, then when you have the fruit, it's even sweeter.
That's great, Brent. Let me do one more question here, and then we'll head to breakout groups. But Susie asked, how have you dealt with the loss of position, in quotes, in the community? Most people won't view you as a pastor in level 5, or may not. And how did it feel not to speak to a crowd, 4 different campuses every week? How'd you deal with your ego, et cetera? So first part is position in the city. Second part is just speaking on the weekend.
Well, for one thing, Susie, I probably had some ego that I never should have had in the first place. I think that it really brings you back to your call, that your identity comes from who God says you are and not from what people say. I think the other thing is that I have friends right now, many of you on this call. I'm pumped for Lubbock to spend time with you. And I have some relationships and friendships right now that I've never had before. I think a lot of pastors are very alienated and alone, and we don't have deep relationships. I'm not saying this for everybody. Again, I'm saying it for my own personal learning. So some of the ways that I found value in my identity and my position weren't particularly healthy, Susie. And now I think I have relationships that are meaningful. Joe and I were just hanging out yesterday. We get together every week and just update and pray together. And like, man, I'm so grateful for my friendship and my partnership in ministry with Joe. And it's unlike any ministry relationship I've ever had in my entire life. And God will reward you with different things, and he will bless you with different things. And you'll realize that the depth of his kingdom is far beyond what you could imagine if you'll just be obedient.